Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this early morning for the launch of the Australian Law Reform Commission's report, Safe, Informed, Supported, Reforming Justice Responses to Sexual Violence. I acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. I pay my deep respects to elders past and present and acknowledge First Nations people joining us today. I also acknowledge the many First Nations people and Aboriginal community-controlled organisations who contributed to this inquiry. I'm Ruth Barson, the Executive Director at the Australian Law Reform Commission. I have the great privilege of leading an exceptionally talented and committed team of researchers and lawyers. This seminal report and the 64 recommendations we made for reform would not have been possible without the diligent work of the Australian Law Reform Commission inquiry team, the leadership of the Honourable Marcia Neve, Judge Kadelka and Justice Bromberg, and the expertise of the Lived Experience Expert Advisory Group. Our hope is that the report contributes to more just outcomes for people who have experienced sexual violence and more accountability for those who use sexual violence. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll jump straight into introductions. We are lucky to have Patricia Karvelas moderating today's panel. As many of you know, Patricia is one of Australia's leading journalists. On the panel, we have Emma Rosenberg, who is a member of the Lived Experience Expert Advisory Group and also the Executive Director of With You We Can. Justice Bromberg is the President of the Australian Law Reform Commission, a federal court judge, and was a co-commissioner on this inquiry. The Honourable Marcia Neve AO, who has been at the forefront of gender-based violence law reform for over 2 decades, maybe 3, and was also a co-commissioner on this inquiry. Before handing over to Patricia, we are very privileged today to begin with a video message from the Honourable Julia Gillard AC, the 27th Prime Minister of Australia. As many of you know, Julia has been outspoken on the treatment of women in professional and public life, and post-politics, Julia has continued to focus on the importance of women and girls' access to education and leadership roles.
Hello, I'm sorry I can't be there in person for the launch of this incredibly important report on reforming justice responses to sexual violence. I know many of you have worked tirelessly over the past 12 months to contribute to this inquiry, and some of the findings are deeply shocking. The prevalence of sexual violence is staggering. Around 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 7 boys experience child sexual abuse. 1 in 5 women over the age of 15 have experienced sexual violence. And some groups, such as First Nations women, women with disability and migrant women, experience sexual violence at much higher rates. 9 out of 10 women don't report it to the police. And when a victim does engage with the justice system, it is often short-lived, with few reports proceeding to court. I'm sure you all agree this is simply not good enough. Victims, their families, our communities deserve more. I commend the Australian Law Reform Commission and all those who contributed to this groundbreaking report. The Commission has yet again shone a spotlight on a complex legal and policy issue our nation is grappling with. We all know the justice system can and must play a critical role in responding to sexual violence, and in this report, a path forward is laid out. I truly hope your findings and recommendations for reform deliver vastly improved outcomes for all those who suffer sexual violence and far greater accountability for those who commit these terrible crimes. It is only through your crucial work that this can be achieved. For that, I thank you and I wish you the very best.
Hello and let's try again. Hello, well it is on. They think I can't press the button. I'm going to continue anyway because I'm quite certain you can hear I pressed the wrong button. Allegedly. Okay, Justice Bromberg, I want to begin with you. What won't be surprising, even though it's quite a staggering and startling figure, is the non-engagement with the criminal justice system for so many people, particularly women who find themselves victims of sexual violence. This under-engagement is the biggest issue that the justice system faces. Was that surprising to you, just the extent of it?
It was surprising to me. And what was also somewhat surprising to me was that we haven't, as a society, properly focused on that part of the problem. We've tended to focus on improving the ill treatment of complainants through the criminal justice system. And of course, we should be focusing on that, and probably 40 or more of our recommendations focus on that. We need to continue to focus on that. But the 9 out of 10 who are out there not engaging, we haven't focused on so much. And one of the things that I think our inquiry does, and does well, is focus on what might be termed the iceberg, rather than the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, and of course, surprising, but also for those of us who talk to women and are women, we know that that is the standard story. That is part of life. Most of the women in my circles are victims and have never interacted with police and don't feel like they can or will. So changing that is huge. I want to bring you in, Sarah, and welcome. Of course, the justice system is failing victims. I think that's largely accepted by certainly your report, but I think more broadly now, and survivors. What was your experience of the justice system?
Heavy for the morning.
Well, I thought I'd start sort of not subtle.
Just want to flag, Patricia, that it's not just failing victims at all. The community's genuine right to prosecute offenders is completely at stake at the moment with the status quo. So the ill treatment of victims is actually the least of it. Although, of course, it's a very large part. My experience with the justice system was hellish. It was beyond my worst expectations, and I went in with eyes wide open. I have a chronic illness, and my health being at stake, the people around me begged and pleaded for me not to report. I was alone, I was in the dark, I had no information about the decisions being made about me, without me, and my mother was a lawyer. I'm white, I am straight, I am cisgendered, I speak English. Like, the privilege is just enormous, and if I found it as difficult as I did, and my family found it as difficult as we did, you know, what's it like for majority of victims in this country?
That's quite confronting, especially, I mean, all of those categories you say, but particularly when you say your mother even understood the system and still it was hard to navigate. You've seen the blueprint in this report, and you've been a key advisor for lived experience. How transformative are some of these recommendations?
I want to say something maybe a little bit controversial.
Great. I live for that.
I actually think, Morty, that we have focused on the tip of the iceberg, but for me that's rather than the below. But for me, I don't want to be encouraging anyone to engage with the system as it is, as you investigated it. I think the reforms in there, particularly independent legal representation, and some of those ones that do really put someone in the victim's corner, have the opportunity to transform the experience of the victim as they traverse that system, and also to transform the outcomes or lack thereof that we're seeing at the moment. And I think that's really important, that we see those top-down sort of impacts before more people are going to be willing to engage, no matter what we do. We need top-down and bottom-up approaches. And for me, as I see it, a lot of these are top-down, but that's not me trying to minimise. That for me is a real passion of mine, because I often feel at odds encouraging people to report or engage at all when victims currently in the system are just cannon fodder.
Well, it's the re-traumatisation that you worry about. You think, is this going to advance this person, right?
Yeah. I mean, the justice system tries to put you in, like, the point of the justice system is to put you back to where you were before the crime with remedy. And that's just not possible when it comes to sexual violence. Like, I will be recovering for my entire life. What it can do at its very minimum is give victims information, support, dignity, respect, legal representation as they navigate a system that would largely collapse without their cooperation and willingness to come forward. The re-traumatisation, I think people often, when they hear that, they think, oh, it means telling your story over and over. And most of us probably can tell you our story in our sleep. Like, we dream about it most nights. I can dissociate and talk to you all about what I experienced. It's not that. It's that right at the time you're trying to reclaim your agency, it's taken away from you again, just like it was when you were assaulted. And so these reforms at their core are about giving agency back to the victim, and that is what is key. And so it's something I'm really excited by.
Marcia, I want to bring you in. What supports and improvements would make the most difference, do you think, in shifting that burden that currently exists?
I think is this on? Yes, it is. Good. There's no green light, but it's on. I think that
now you have to speak in it.
Hold it up. Thank you. I think the initial reception, when a person is thinking about what to do, when this terrible thing has happened to them, what do I do? People need to know a clear path, and they need to have advice about the choices they can make. And one of our recommendations is that everybody be entitled to consultation with a lawyer to discuss with them what their options are. You might not want to report to the police. You might decide it's too much for you. You might want to know what happens when you do report to the police. You might want to know what the other options are, for example, restorative justice, or just waiting for a while and processing it before you decide to report. A whole series of propositions. And I think you need that immediately, as well as all of the other support that you can get from bodies that are not legal bodies at all, but the organisations that exist, at least in some states, to support people who've been subjected to this horrible experience.
Once people are in the justice system, right, once they're engaged, how does that system currently fail them? In the most profound ways. I mean, I know this is, you could talk for 5 hours, but...
That's right. Well, initially, of the 1 in 9 who do engage with the criminal justice system by reporting to police, we know that up to 85%, in relation to 85 or so percent, the engagement is short-lived. It never proceeds to a charge. There was an inquiry conducted in the ACT recently, and its findings are interesting and important. And one of the recommendations we made is that there be similar inquiries across the country, scrutinising the very, very high, unacceptably high attrition rates. So engagement not only needs to occur, but it needs to be maintained. And many of our recommendations, those that go to legal advice, the support of a justice system navigator, and many of our recommendations are directed not only to improve the experience of the complainant once that person is engaged, but they're there to sustain that engagement because the withdrawal rate is high. It's really high. Sometimes it's not anything in particular that's been done by the police or a judge, or it's just the burden.
It's just overwhelming.
It's just overwhelming. And what our report wants us all to recognise is that it's just so unfair to expect an individual who's been violated, traumatised in the way that she has, to bear that burden on her own. The justice system needs to do a lot more to provide the support that's necessary. And we want our community to be safe. If perpetrators are never brought to account, how are we ever going to deal with the problem of sexual violence? And we need to remember that as well, that not only are the majority of people who experience sexual violence never given access to a just outcome, those who've perpetrated the crime or the wrong are never brought to account. Our community is no safer.
Marcia, I think it's important to talk about the differences of how people experience the criminal justice system. And I think, Sarah, you made that point really powerfully about the fact that, well, you know, there is obviously women who experience it disproportionately, but then among women, the statistics are so off the charts, for instance, for First Nations women. Can you just talk to me about that difference in experience and how that can be addressed through your recommendations?
Well, we do have some very specific recommendations about First Nations people. And as we know, there's a high rate of sexual assault, unfortunately, in those communities. And in remote areas, for instance, they may not be able to see a police person report to police for days and days and days. So we need to have measures that are addressed to the particular problems that people experience in particular communities. Migrant women, women who come here from overseas, women who work on farms and experience horrible things happening to them in those contexts. So I think we need to have some specifically targeted measures for those. But we need to recognise diversity not only in the experiences of people in the justice system, but in what they want. And so we need to have a range of different mechanisms for not just people who want to report to the police or who aren't sure or who need to be supported to maintain their contact in the justice system, but other mechanisms as well. So that's one of the reasons that the report has a chapter in it on restorative justice, because some people say, I don't want to be involved in the criminal justice system, I may not want to be involved in any of those other justice possibilities, but I do want to have this person held to account. I do want to talk about how this affected me, and I don't want this to happen to anyone else. And that will be the goal of some people. That's what they will want as a result of their experience.
Let's talk about that a bit more, Morty, because that's I think that anecdotally, I think there's a lot of particularly women who really seek that outcome. Women who know that the criminal justice system can fail, but they want justice for themselves or change. That for a legal system is quite radical thinking. What are the alternatives that you talk about, and how can they work within our system?
Well, we've got 2 chapters on civil justice, which is often forgotten in this debate. And we've made some real improvements in that area. the Respect at Work report that the Human Rights Commission put out is a fabulous report, and a lot of good law reform has occurred as a result. So the prohibition on sexual harassment, that's in the Fair Work Act now, and as it is in the Sex Discrimination Act, is available. Sexual harassment is broadly defined. It covers every form of sexual violence. In the workplace, there have been measures put in place where access is available to a tribunal, the Fair Work Commission, to deal with sexual harassment. There is a regulator in the field, so the Fair Work Ombudsman can actually help to bear the burden of bringing a proceeding and supporting an individual through a proceeding. We have pointed to that in our report. We've made recommendations about how that can be extended beyond the workplace, so that sexual harassment, including the obligation to prevent sexual harassment that is currently in the Sex Discrimination Act, applies essentially across the board, beyond the workplace, applies to misconduct that occurs on the street or in universities. So there are some really important recommendations. I'm glad you've given me the opportunity to say so. There are some really important recommendations. There are some real opportunities to provide people who've experienced sexual violence justice outcomes that are bespoke to their needs, because there's a diversity of needs. Not everybody wants to go down the criminal justice pathway. And of course, restorative justice is another option. And we've made recommendations that hopefully will better connect people who've experienced sexual violence with a restorative justice option.
Sarah, I think to have a discussion without thinking about the broader context we're currently living in is quite meaningless. And we are not known to be shy about calling things out. And so we are in a massive backlash at the moment, which is one I have not seen in my lifetime. And what's available, the content available to men particularly and younger men is so alarming, as we have this incredible piece of work to change the system, but at the same time we've got an unregulated environment where people are seeing normalised behaviours which we know are criminal. How does that land on you and people fighting this system at the moment? And just talk to me about the complexity of the current environment.
For anyone not putting up what we're putting down, is just prior to picking up this microphone, we were chatting a little bit about it seems women have too many rights again, and so we're seeing an overcorrection back the other way from a lot of young men. And
well, there's been the extradition of the Tate brothers, for instance, to the United States. We've got the normalisation of this sort of stuff.
And Mr. President as well over there. And so much of that is not the fault of young men as well. They are exposed. I was listening to, I don't know if anyone knows Daniel Principe, who's an incredible advocate for young men and the kind of role model that we very much need. I sort of wish everyone could see a big screening of his talks, whether they're in school or not. But young men are exposed to this content and these norms and the peer pressure to conform to them so early. And it's kind of like, well, what do we expect when we have a justice system where so few people are held to account? the most common type of offending is reoffending. So the recidivism rate there is huge. And then the way that the victim is the one who feels like they're on trial and has no one in their corner, even human rights seem to go out the window, where an alleged offender can rake through their private history, their medical records, sexual history, all of it. And then a jury sees that, and those myths and misconceptions are confirmed in their eyes. And then you've got alleged perpetrators walking out emboldened more than ever. It's kind of like, what do we expect? When we say rape is second only to murder, and yet the country has largely decriminalised it. It is sort of laughable for people to critique the current culture without acknowledging, like, of course it was going to end up this way.
Yeah, we're in a difficult environment, and yet you've delivered, Marcia, a report to the government that they are clearly acting on at some levels, and obviously there's more work to come here. There is that recommendation. You've already alluded to it, but I just want to explore it a bit more, because it's different to other, classes of victims in relation to independent legal advice.
Yes.
And I want you to explain why it deserves that different treatment.
I think because of the myths that Sarah's referred to around sexual assault, because of the shame that has historically been associated. I mean, women were blamed for being raped, and it was their behaviour that brought this shocking offence, made it happen. So for those reasons, I think we have to really focus very closely on how we change behaviour, and the mechanism, and also we need to understand more about how some of the things that Sarah's referred to actually work in practice. We don't know a lot. We've got lots of individual cases where bad things happen, but we don't always compile that systematically. So one of the issues that's in the report, and it doesn't sound very exciting, is the importance of actually understanding how the system is working and exposing that to view. So we can talk about it in a general way, but looking, for example, do these reforms make a difference? If we change X, does that change what the outcome will be? Does that mean that victims are treated more respectfully, given more support, and so on? Now, just going back to your question, because you asked me about independent legal advice, that means that people get a very clear statement from the beginning about what they can do and what they can't do, and where the possibilities are for support and assistance. And that, I think, can change things for individuals. And then in some very specific areas, and one is the area of confidential counselling. So we would like people who experience rape or some other form of sexual assault to be able to get support from a counsellor. But if there's a risk that what they've told the counsellor will be brought into court and used to cross-examine them and expose them, then that is something that will discourage people from that process. And so we need to ensure that the protections that exist there are appropriate, that they appropriately balance the need to protect individuals, to get them access to support, and the need to make sure that relevant material is before the court. So that's one of the things where we've said if there's an application for access to confidential counselling, then you will get the support of a lawyer in those circumstances to help you.
Justice Bromberg, this is a kind of wider question about the system that you operate in. Is the system ready for these changes? There has been. I mean, look, it's an obvious question because we have a system that's been resistant to change.
I think that the system is more than capable of providing some real relief. One of the reasons that the system is not doing what it should be doing is because it's not being engaged. But what we need to understand is that the justice system is largely at fault for that non-engagement. And so if we can address those barriers to engagement which the justice system is responsible for, then we will give the justice system the opportunity to operate as it should operate. And if it operates in that way, I think it really can make a meaningful, a significant effect. And the problem of sexual violence will begin to be dealt with. It's not really being dealt with at the moment. It's not a problem that's going to go away unless the justice system begins to do its job. I think our report provides the roadmap for allowing the justice system to begin to do its job in an effective way, in a way that it is capable of doing. But to date, for all sorts of reasons, it's not being doing or not being doing sufficiently well.
Marcia?
Yes, I think we're talking about culture change, and from the areas that I've worked in over a long period of time, culture change takes a long time. But I think, as Maudie said, we have created a roadmap, a way forward, and all of the processes of evaluation that we've described will tell us whether the roadmap is working and where you need to change it. We won't get it. No law reform ever gets it all right at any one time, but you can identify additional areas of problems and you can respond to them if you have that information before you about how it's working. So we don't even have at the moment good data on how different states perform. We'd like to know, wouldn't we, whether they're doing it better in one state than in another. And
so we don't have a best practice model.
We don't. And some states are further advanced than others, and this was a harmonisation project. But we don't quite know why this state is working better than that. Is it resources? Is it distance? Is it the composition of the legal profession? The judiciary? Heaven help us. What causes these differences? And we won't know that until we start looking very systematically at what happens in different jurisdictions and whether the outcomes for people are better. Whether more people report, for example.
So is that the metric?
I think that's one important
It has to be,
metric.
doesn't it? If it's 9
Yes.
out of 10 that don't,
Yes.
the metric has to be to lift that number, right?
That's right. And then the metric has to be that the reports proceed. And as Maudie said before, one of the issues is that people go to the police, they report, either the matter isn't proceeded with or they drop out because they think, I can't bear this, I need to recover and I can't keep on with this process. So that's a very important metric. It's not the only one, but it's an important one.
But I do think it's a really important one because, I mean, and I'm sure there's others in this room, anyone who's raising, teenage girls, there have been a lot of I'm not going to name them, but high-profile cases, and I've had my 15-year-old daughter say to me, I would never let myself go through that. And it's broken me as a mother because I've thought, well, okay, that's a young person deciding from what they've seen that they don't think that system will look after them if they were to go through that.
Can I just say one other thing? We have talked about girls, and of course we know that there's a much higher rate of sexual violence experienced by women than men. But for young men who are sexually assaulted, there are also some barriers, and you can imagine what they might be, in reporting and being treated appropriately when they do report.
No, I think that's a very,
and I think
very
we
important
need to
point.
make that point.
No, it's a very important point. Sarah, you wanted to say something?
I had a few. I wanted to jump in a few times. There's so much to talk about. Prosecutors themselves, over my dead body, would they put their daughters through the system? We're seeing that Susie Miller, who is the writer of Prima Facie, if anyone's seen it. I mean, she did that in the UK, but I think if we did that here, it would be very much the same when you've got whistleblowers left, right and centre coming from the DPPs in each jurisdiction. you've got people who are leaving their jobs because they can't deal with the vicarious trauma, and not of the horrors of the cases they're dealing with, but because of what they're putting the victims through while they're waiting in that queue for months or even years for a trial. I just wanted to circle back to the roadmap, I guess, that's been spoken about a little bit, because we'll be able to see if it's working. There's so many great data gathering sort of research initiatives that have been recommended in this report, but we can also look to other countries as our roadmap. Like, Australia lags behind so many other jurisdictions that are it's not even like other neoliberal or democratic countries. Like, you've got like India and Japan providing independent legal representation to victims, seeing amazing outcomes, seeing better substantive justice outcomes, so guilty verdicts, and not just that, the flow down effects to the employment rate for victims, the cost of recovery for victims. It's, this is a huge taxpayer body that we rely on to keep us safe, and right now I think everyone should be concerned that that money has not been put to its best use. And so I think that independent, the legal advice that Marcia's touched on, but not just advice, representation where it really matters, to help close that, I guess, power gap, that imbalance that we're seeing where victims are just a witness in their case. And we're not saying let's make them a party to proceedings. We're not saying let's uproot the entire adversarial justice system. We're just saying, I think in the words of Michael O'Connell, who is a friend and colleague of mine, that we just need to start seeing victims as valued participants in these cases, that they are central to. And there are, dozens and dozens of examples where we can see that overseas. And I've pulled together advocates and academics and services over the last few years, and most recently in the in news.com.au's Take the Stand campaign, where we've highlighted all these other countries that are doing this, and if they can do it, we can too. So I think it's really positive.
Can I make one important point about our attempt through our recommendations to improve engagement? It's all about choice. It has nothing to do with compulsion and nothing to do with blame. It's all about giving people who have experienced sexual violence the information they need in order to make a well-informed choice. A choice about whether to engage, and then if they make the choice to engage, a choice about what are the justice system options that best address their needs. So I think that's important to emphasise. We are not going to compel people to engage. That will never work. The only thing we can do is to provide the choice, the agency, the control that Sarah spoke about, and to provide the supports, because support is so important. It's a scary world, the justice system, for any person who've experienced sexual violence. It's scary enough for someone like Sarah and someone with the privileges that Sarah spoke of. How scary is it for a First Nations person raped on a remote community in circumstances where the whole of the community fears police? In a way, there's
a lack of trust with police.
Complete lack of trust. So we've got to reach out to those people, and we've got to provide them with the information they need in order that they can make a choice. And when they make a choice to engage, we need to support them. and it's just critical.
Now I'm going to open up to any questions from you. So if you want to indicate with a hand up, I'm looking intensely in people's eyes. I have another couple of questions if you don't, and if you feel like we've addressed most of the points. Okay, well I will ask my question. See, you wait long enough.
Sorry, and the answer might be in the report. Apologies, I haven't read it in full. I was wondering which jurisdiction in Australia is leading the way in terms of reporting rates?
Which jurisdiction in Australia is leading the way in terms of reporting rates?
I don't think we know that. There was an ACT examination of what was happening there with police, but I don't think we have reliable data that tells you this state does it better than another, which is one of the reasons that we've emphasised at so many points in the report the need for the collection of that information.
That's wild. How are we in 2025 and we don't have the data to compare our own jurisdictions? No, what's wrong with us? Like, why? I just find holes like that unacceptable.
Yeah, that's right. Many people who experience sexual violence told us about how different it is for them or for people, depending on which side of the border you were raped on. There are wild differences in terms of financial assistance, in terms of availability of legal process, in terms of attitudes of police.
And prosecutors too.
And prosecutors,
I suspect.
yeah.
We don't have very good data on that either. So.
Thank you so much for the report and to the ALRC team. My name is I'm its Legal Services Victoria. We really welcome the introduction and emphasis on legal advice, but if that legal advice is pointing to the same dead ends that are often described by victim survivors, I guess my question is, how do you determine that legal advice is really important, but not really extending that to end-to-end legal assistance and support through the whole court process?
It's a good question.
Firstly, I'd say that our attempt to improve engagement is not limited to the provision of legal advice or the provision of other support. We've also made recommendations about extending the remedies that are available, giving courts the capacity, both civil courts and other courts, the capacity to, for instance, make orders requiring a respondent to attend a men's behavioural course or to begin to, deal through counselling or through other therapeutic measures with their behaviour. Our recommendations shine a light on the fact that justice outcomes are available well beyond the criminal justice system. So it's not a matter of persuading or trying to encourage people to engage because they'll be better supported and advised. It's also making them recognise, and the legal advice can do that, that there is a wide diversity of options and some new options that they perhaps didn't know about, restorative justice. In that respect, I think we can provide better options and therefore provide greater incentive to engage. But we do think that end-to-end support is necessary. There is end-to-end support in terms of legal advice recommended. We don't recommend end-to-end legal representation. We do recommend some targeted representation in criminal trials. There are difficulties with end-to-end legal representation. They're a little bit too complex for us to get into right now. But we do make recommendations about other measures for protecting complainants. For instance, we shine a light on the obligations upon judges, the legal obligation that's there now in Section 41 of the Evidence Act, to control cross-examination, to ensure cross-examination is not harassing, is not intimidating, does not rely on stereotypes of the kind that myths and misconceptions rely on. Despite that law being there, it's not really being applied, or not being applied as often and as well as it should be. So we make recommendations about training because beyond legal representation and legal advice, the courts themselves need to get involved in making sure that the experience of a complainant is an appropriate experience. So there are a suite of measures, and there'll need to be cultural change. There'll need to be training. There'll need to be better guidelines. We make recommendations across. Although we've made 64 recommendations, we've probably dealt with over 100 issues.
Yep.
And so we'd like to see those recommendations implemented. We think they can make a difference. And we welcome the government's initial response. The government's put up some $20 million that's mainly going to go...
trials.
Well, that'll go to... there are pilots out there at the moment that are doing what we have recommended should occur across the board, and that is to provide the legal advice and navigational support that's needed. There are pilots in 3 states now, and the money that has been provided by government is very welcome, and will go to those pilots and to create further pilots in a number of other states, I think. So that's a start. It's only a start. Our recommendations do call upon government to put their hands in their pocket. But let's remember that, and I don't want to deal with this purely in terms of financial costs, because we all know that there's a huge human cost that always has to be at the forefront of the equation. But in terms of financial cost, $26 billion a year is the cost of violence against women and girls. 26 billion. We need to keep that in mind when we think about what resources our society should put to this very good cause.
Now, we're nearly out of time, but I'm going to take a final question.
So I'm Michaela Cronin, I'm the Domestic Family and Sexual Violence Commissioner, and I really want to thank the work that's been done by the task force. I particularly, though, was pleased to see the extension of the expert advisory panel, and I'm really curious about what you want to achieve in that time and what you're thinking about, because it's all about implementation, right? It's all about, this is a complex roadmap to that you have laid out for a very complex problem, and we know that this is going to take a long time. So how are we going to keep moving in terms of implementation? And the advocates, and you've referred to a number of the fabulous advocates who work in this space, including you and the work that you've done, that's so critical to making sure we stay on track, and that when something has unintended consequences, we listen to how we keep changing and adapt to get the outcome that we all want.
By the way, it's Sarah, not Eva.
Sorry, Sarah. Sorry.
Sarah, you are our last speaker, and the perfect
Gotta keep it quick, got
end
it.
voice.
Keeping lived experience at the forefront of everything we do, particularly when it comes to implementation, the proof being in the pudding, of course, with these reforms, is so vital. And I think we're seeing such an amazing shift towards that, a much needed, long-awaited shift towards engaging lived experience in policy and decision making. And I think we have the independent collective of survivors to thank for the bulk of that push in recent years. Of course, knowing that we all stand on the shoulders of the incredible women who've come before us. I think the expert advisory group, the EAG in particular, what a remarkable group of women and men who are not just advocates and not just victims or survivors or however they identify. They are legal, in the legal profession, legal academics, researchers, social workers. Like, the intellect in that group is really astounding, and to see funds go towards the extension and use of a group like that, I think is really promising. I hope that the advocates themselves see more of those funds personally. And I mean, it takes a lot. You can imagine the cost of dredging up lived experience day after day. So I'm hopeful. I think it's a really good promise. I hope that we do see it. I wish that we could see beyond election cycles. And there's such short-term thinking in Australia. I wish this was a whole of government thing, and I hope that this work will continue to be done no matter what we see from the election. I think Australia's got a lot to learn from other countries there when it comes to those national strategies to fix problems such as these. But yeah, the EAG group is phenomenal, and something that I will hold close to me from this experience, certainly. And we're all really looking forward to be able to continue doing the work.
I want to thank our excellent panel. Yes, they deserve a round of applause. And also, congratulate you, as others have in the room, for this, I think, really, seminal piece of work, which hopefully will put us on a trajectory of positive change in our country to actually reduce violence. That's ultimately what the aim is, to make everyone's life more fulfilling, and to think about all of the victim survivors who have, pushed this for so long. Thank you so much. And
Can I thank you?
oh, thanks. Okay. All right, I'll take it.
I'd really like to thank PK for her
Thank you.
time, her energy and her passion. And of course, Julia Gillard. I mean, what a wonderful introduction from someone who cares about this issue really deeply. And the ALRC is really very grateful to you both. Very grateful to the expert advisory group as well. And I'm very grateful to our staff who really worked extraordinarily hard. We were short on resources, we were short on time, and a lot was achieved. So can I thank all of the ALRC staff as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And final word from me, because I can't help but have the last word. Sarah, you gave me a really good idea for questions for the opposition as well, in terms of making sure this goes beyond just 3 years. We don't know what the election outcome will be, but we need to reform the criminal justice system regardless of who's in charge politically. So thank you. Goodbye. Have a great day, everyone.